In the year 1050 AD, one of the largest cities in the world sat along the banks of the Mississippi River in what is now southern Illinois. Its population was somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people, possibly more. That made it bigger than London at the time, bigger than Paris, comparable to the great urban centres of medieval Europe. It had massive earthen pyramids, a grand central plaza larger than 35 football fields, sophisticated astronomical observatories, and a complex social hierarchy. It was the centre of a trade network that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains. It was, by every definition, a metropolis, and you were never taught its name. Most Americans have never heard of Cahokia. If they have, it's usually a vague mention in a textbook sidebar, easily forgotten. There's no Cahokia unit in history class, no field trips, no movies or documentaries that reach mainstream consciousness. For a city that dominated the Mississippi River Valley for centuries and influenced cultures across half a continent, that's not just strange, it's suspicious. How does an entire civilization, the largest and most complex society north of Mexico before European contact, just vanish from our collective memory? How does a city with engineering achievements that rival ancient Egypt get reduced to a footnote, if that? This isn't a lost city buried in a jungle somewhere waiting to be discovered. Cahokia's ruins are right there, just a few miles from a major interstate highway, visible from the road. And yet, for most of American history, it was ignored, dismissed, or deliberately erased. Here's what makes this even more bizarre. The people who built Cahokia didn't have a written language, so they left no texts explaining who they were or what happened to them. When European explorers arrived in the region centuries later, Cahokia had already been abandoned for hundreds of years. The massive mounds were still there, impossible to miss, but the descendants of the builders had scattered. The city was silent, and when Europeans saw these enormous earthworks, many refused to believe that Native Americans could have built them. They invented elaborate myths about lost tribes of Israel, wandering Vikings, anyone but the indigenous people who were actually responsible. This erasure wasn't accidental, it was convenient. If you're trying to justify taking land from people you consider primitive, it helps to pretend they never built anything worth remembering. But Cahokia was real, and it was extraordinary. Over the next few hours, we're going to explore how this city rose from nothing to become a powerhouse in less than a century. We'll walk through its massive ceremonial plazas and climb the largest earthen pyramid in North America. We'll look at the astronomical sophistication of its wooden observatories and confront the darker side of its power, including evidence of ritual sacrifice. We'll trace its trade networks across thousands of miles and piece together what daily life might have looked like for the people who called this place home. Then we'll investigate why it collapsed, where its people went, and how America spent centuries trying to forget it ever existed. If you enjoy diving into these kinds of prehistoric mysteries and lost civilizations, you might also like the Sleepy Time history book, which explores more forgotten stories like this one. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com. But right now, we need to go back before Cahokia existed, back to the Mississippi River Valley when it was just scattered villages and endless forests, before anyone imagined a city could rise here at all. The Mississippi River Valley doesn't care about your plans. It floods when it wants to flood. It shifts course when geology tells it to. For thousands of years, it carved and reshaped one of the most dynamic landscapes on the North American continent, creating something that would become absolutely critical to human civilization in this region. A floodplain so rich, so impossibly fertile, that it would eventually support the largest city north of Mexico. This place had a name, though not one the original inhabitants gave it. Modern archaeologists call it the American Bottom. That's not a reference to geography teachers trying to be funny. It's a technical term for the floodplain stretching along the eastern side of the Mississippi River, just below where it meets the Missouri. About 175 square miles of some of the best agricultural land on the entire continent. When the rivers flooded, which they did regularly, they deposited fresh layers of nutrient-rich sediment across the valley floor, year after year, millennium after millennium, building up soil so black and deep you could grow almost anything in it. But it wasn't just the soil. The American bottom sat at a geographic crossroads. Rivers converged here from every direction. The Mississippi flowing down from the north, the Missouri coming in from the west, the Illinois River draining from the northeast, smaller tributaries feeding in from the surrounding uplands. If you wanted to move goods, ideas, or people across the centre of the continent, you passed through here. It was the O'Hare Airport of prehistoric North America, except the plains were canoes and the runways were rivers. The landscape itself was a patchwork of ecosystems packed into a relatively small area. Bottomland forests of oak, hickory, and cypress. Wetlands teeming with fish, turtles, and waterfowl. Prairie grasslands on the slightly higher terraces where bison grazed in massive herds. Backwater lakes and oxbow swamps that formed when the river changed course, creating perfect habitats for everything from catfish to mussels to beaver. This wasn't just fertile, this was a biological jackpot, a place where you could hunt, fish, gather and farm all within walking distance of your village. Humans figured this out early. Not in 1050 AD when Cahokia exploded into existence, but thousands of years before that. Archaeological evidence shows people living in the American bottom going back at least 10,000 years, maybe longer. Paleo-Indian hunters tracking megafauna across the grasslands. Archaic period foragers establishing seasonal camps near the rivers. Woodland period villagers building the first permanent settlements and experimenting with the earliest forms of agriculture. By around 600 AD, roughly 450 years before Cahokia's rise, the region was home to what archaeologists call late woodland cultures. These weren't primitive nomads. They were settled communities with sophisticated knowledge of their environment, complex social networks, and the beginnings of what would eventually become Mississippian culture. They lived in small villages, usually just a few dozen people, scattered across the floodplain and the surrounding uplands. Their houses were modest, typically single-family structures with pole frameworks covered in wattle and daub, basically woven branches plastered with mud. But they were already doing something that would prove crucial. They were building mounds, nothing on the scale of what would come later, but small earthen platforms for special buildings, burial mounds for important individuals, ceremonial spaces that required communal labour and planning. The tradition of mound building in the eastern woodlands goes back at least 5,000 years. These late woodland people inherited that tradition and were actively developing it, refining the techniques, expanding the purposes. Their economy was mixed, and that's important. They weren't purely farmers yet. Agriculture was part of the picture, but only part. They grew indigenous crops, mostly native seed plants like goosefoot, marsh elder, sunflower, and squash. These weren't staple crops yet, more like supplements to a diet still heavily dependent on hunting and gathering. Deer, turkey, fish, nuts, berries, roots. The incredible biodiversity of the American bottom meant you could eat well without having to bet everything on your crop succeeding. Then around 800 AD, something started to change. Maize, which had been domesticated in Mexico thousands of years earlier, began appearing in the American bottom in meaningful quantities. Not just a few kernels here and there, but enough to suggest people were actually cultivating it as a crop. Early maize wasn't nearly as productive as modern corn. The cobs were tiny, the kernel small and hard. But it had one massive advantage over the native seed crops: caloric density. You could grow more calories per acre with maize than with almost anything else available. And in a floodplain where growing seasons were relatively short and flooding could be unpredictable, that mattered. But adoption was slow. These late woodland communities weren't abandoning their traditional lifestyles overnight. They were experimenting, testing, seeing what worked. Some villages probably grew more maize than others. Some stuck with the old crops. There was no central authority forcing change, no agricultural revolution being imposed from above. Just dozens of small communities making independent decisions based on local conditions and personal preferences. Life during this period followed seasonal rhythms that had been established over thousands of years. Spring meant planting, fishing the spawning runs, collecting fresh greens. Summer was for tending crops, hunting deer in the forests, gathering berries and nuts as they ripened. Fall brought the harvest, plus the massive annual hunts where entire communities would coordinate to take down large numbers of migrating waterfowl or drive deer into kill zones. Winter meant living off stored food, repairing tools, telling stories, conducting ceremonies, maintaining the social bonds that held communities together. Trade networks were already extensive. Stone from the Ozarks for making tools, copper from the Great Lakes for ornaments and ritual objects, marine shells from the Gulf Coast for beads and gorgets, mica from the Appalachians for ceremonial regalia. These materials show up in burial contexts across the region, proof that information, goods, and ideas were flowing freely between communities separated by hundreds or even thousands of miles. The social structure seems to have been relatively egalitarian, at least compared to what was coming. Burial practices show some individuals getting more elaborate treatment than others, suggesting status differences, but nothing approaching the rigid hierarchies that would characterize Cahokia. Leadership was probably based on personal achievement, respect, maybe spiritual power. Big men and big women who earned their status through generosity, skill or ritual knowledge rather than inheriting it. So by the year 1000 AD, you had a landscape dotted with small villages. Maybe 50 people here, 100 people there, mostly concentrated along the rivers and major streams. Total population in the American bottom was probably a few thousand at most. They were trading with each other, intermarrying, sharing ceremonial practices and probably languages. They built small mounds, held seasonal gatherings, maintained the old traditions while slowly, cautiously, adopting new ones like maize agriculture. It was stable, sustainable, a way of life that could have continued indefinitely, gradually evolving but never fundamentally changing. And then around 1050 AD, something happened. Something that still puzzles archaeologists today. Within just a few decades, maybe even faster, those scattered villages transformed into something completely unprecedented. Population exploded. Monumental construction projects began on a scale that had never been seen before in North America. Social hierarchies crystallized seemingly overnight. The entire political and religious landscape of the eastern woodlands was turned upside down. This wasn't gradual change, this was detonation, and we still don't fully understand what lit the fuse. The archaeological evidence for what happened next reads like a fever dream. Literally overnight in historical terms, the American bottom transformed from a landscape of scattered villages into the largest urban center north of Mexico. We're not talking about gradual growth over centuries. We're talking about a population explosion and construction boom compressed into maybe 2-3 decades at most. Between approximately 1050 and 1100 AD, Cahokia went from basically nothing to a metropolis that would have rivaled many European cities of the same period. The numbers are staggering, and they're still debated fiercely among archaeologists. Conservative estimates put Cahokia's peak population around 10,000 to 15,000 people living in the urban core. That alone would make it larger than London in 1050 AD. But other scholars look at the settlement patterns, the outlying communities, the sheer scale of the construction projects, and argue for numbers closer to 20,000, 30,000, maybe even 40,000 people when you include the greater metropolitan area. Some researchers have pushed estimates even higher, suggesting that at its peak, Cahokia and its surrounding region might have supported 50,000 or more inhabitants. Think about what that means. In just a few decades, you'd need to gather more people into one place than had ever assembled anywhere north of Mexico in human history. You'd need to feed them, house them, organize them, convince them to stay and participate in massive communal construction projects. And somehow, incredibly, it happened. The physical evidence is undeniable. Thousands of structures built in a coordinated pattern. Over 120 earthen mounds, many of them requiring millions of basket loads of soil moved by hand. A massive wooden palisade surrounding the central precinct, built and rebuilt multiple times, each version using thousands of logs that had to be cut, transported, and erected. We're talking about a construction effort that would have required organising tens of thousands of personnels of labour, all happening in the span of a generation or two. This wasn't organic sprawl. This wasn't villages gradually growing and merging together over centuries. The archaeological record shows something much stranger. Evidence of deliberate urban planning. The city was laid out along carefully aligned axes, mounds positioned in geometric patterns, residential areas organised into distinct neighbourhoods. The Grand Plaza, covering over 40 acres, was levelled and filled to create a perfectly flat ceremonial space. This required moving something like 900,000 cubic feet of earth. Somebody was making decisions, somebody had a vision, somebody convinced thousands of people to abandon their scattered villages and come participate in building something that had never existed before. But who and why? The theories are all over the map, and none of them fully satisfying. Some archaeologists point to the idea of a charismatic leader, a prophet or chief who emerged with a compelling new religious vision and the political skill to unite the region under their authority. There's precedent for this in other cultures. Charismatic religious movements can spread incredibly fast, transforming societies within a generation. Maybe Cahokia was founded by a figure like that, someone whose name and story have been lost to time, but whose influence reshaped the entire Mississippi Valley. Others look to the sky. On July 4th, 1054 AD, Chinese astronomers recorded a guest star appearing in the heavens. It was actually a supernova, the explosive death of a massive star, and it was bright enough to be visible during daylight for weeks, remaining visible at night for almost 2 years. Native American rock art from the southwest seems to depict this event. Could it have been visible from the American bottom too? Could such a dramatic celestial phenomenon have been interpreted as a sign, a cosmic endorsement of a new religious movement or political order? The timing is suggestive, right at the beginning of Cahokia's explosive growth. But maybe the answer is more practical. Maybe it was about corn. By 1050 AD, maize varieties had developed to the point where they could produce reliable surpluses in the American bottom's growing conditions. Suddenly you could support larger populations in a smaller area. Suddenly you had the agricultural foundation for urbanization. Maybe people flooded into Cahokia not because of prophets or supernovas, but because it was where the food was, where you could feed your family more reliably than in scattered upland villages vulnerable to local crop failures. Or maybe all of these factors converged at once. A charismatic leader with a new religious vision, a celestial event that seemed to validate that vision, and an agricultural revolution that made the whole thing practically feasible. History rarely has simple causes. The most transformative moments usually happen when multiple forces align, creating conditions that weren't possible before and won't be possible again. What we know for certain is that people came from everywhere. This wasn't just local villagers consolidating. Ceramic styles, tool types, architectural traditions, burial practices all show evidence of populations arriving from across the entire Mississippi Valley and beyond, from the Great Lakes region, from the southeast, from the Great Plains, possibly even from the southwest. Cahokia became cosmopolitan almost instantly, a meeting place for diverse peoples who brought their own traditions, languages, and social practices. That diversity was both strength and tension. Having access to knowledge and skills from across half a continent gave Cahokia enormous creative and economic advantages. But it also meant throwing together populations who had been culturally distinct, who had different ideas about leadership, religion, proper social behaviour. The archaeological evidence hints at this tension. Distinct neighbourhoods with different architectural styles, suggesting ethnic or cultural enclaves, evidence of violence in some burial contexts, signs of social stratification emerging rapidly, probably as some groups or individuals gained control over resources and religious authority. This was a pressure cooker. Thousands of people with no historical precedent for living together at this scale, all trying to figure out how to make a city work. And somehow, against all odds, they did. For a while. But before we get to the tensions and eventual collapse, we need to understand what they built. Because what rose from the American bottom starting in 1050 AD was something that wouldn't be matched in North America for another 800 years. At the centre of this new metropolis they built a mountain. Not a symbolic hill, not a modest platform, a genuine mountain constructed entirely by human hands, basket by basket, over decades of back-breaking labour. Monk's Mound, named centuries later for French monks who farmed at its base, is the largest earthen structure in the Americas, and when you actually grasp the scale, when you let the numbers sink in, it becomes clear this wasn't just impressive engineering. This was a civilization announcing to the cosmos that it had arrived. The base covers 14 acres. Let that register. 14 acres. That's roughly 10 football fields of ground completely covered by a pyramid that rises in 4 massive terraces to a height of 100 feet. From the summit you could see for miles across the floodplain in every direction. Every village, every outlying community, every canoe on the Mississippi, all of it visible from this artificial mountain that dominated the landscape like nothing natural ever could. But the truly staggering number is volume. Monk's Mound contains approximately 22 million cubic feet of earth. To put that in perspective, it holds more material by volume than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Great Pyramid is taller, yes, but only because stone stacks more efficiently than soil. In terms of actual stuff moved by human muscle, Cahokia's central monument rivals anything constructed in ancient Egypt. Except the Egyptians had copper tools, sophisticated mathematics, and according to some theories, elaborate mechanical advantages we're still debating. The Cahokians had digging sticks, stone tools and woven baskets. No wheels, no draft animals, no pulleys or levers. Just human beings, thousands of them, organized into work crews that must have functioned with military precision, all carrying loads of earth weighing 50-60 pounds up increasingly steep inclines day after day, year after year. Archaeologists estimate it would have taken roughly 15 million basket loads to complete the structure. If you had 300 workers moving an average of 20 loads per day, which is brutal labour, you're looking at roughly 7 years of continuous construction. But Monk's Mound wasn't built continuously. It was constructed in at least 14 separate stages, each representing a distinct construction episode, each requiring mobilizing massive labour forces, probably during agricultural off-seasons when people weren't needed in the fields. This tells us something profound about Cahokian society. They had the organizational capacity to coordinate these massive communal projects repeatedly over generations. They could feed, house, and manage labor forces in the thousands. They had leadership structures capable of making collective decisions about design modifications and expansion phases. They had social mechanisms, probably a combination of religious obligation, political authority, and communal identity, that convinced people to participate in these monumentally difficult projects. And they had engineers who knew exactly what they were doing. Because here's what separates Monk's Mound from a giant pile of dirt. The internal structure is sophisticated in ways that weren't fully appreciated until modern archaeological techniques revealed them. The builders didn't just stack earth randomly. They used different soil types in specific locations, clay layers to prevent water infiltration, sand lenses for drainage, alternating loads of different materials to create internal stability. They were managing soil mechanics without formal engineering education, using empirical knowledge gained through trial and error to solve problems that wouldn't be formally understood until modern civil engineering. The terracing wasn't arbitrary either. Each level was carefully designed to distribute weight, prevent slumping, and create stable platforms for additional construction. The angles, the setbacks, the proportions, all of it shows evidence of deliberate planning. Somebody understood that you couldn't just pile earth into a 100-foot cone and expect it to stand for centuries. Somebody knew about load distribution, drainage management, and the behavior of different soil types under compression and moisture stress. Recent archaeological work has revealed even more sophistication. There's evidence of deliberate foundation preparation before construction began, with the natural ground surface modified to create a stable base. There are traces of internal wooden frameworks, logs laid horizontally to reinforce key structural points, acting almost like rebar in modern concrete. There are carefully constructed drainage channels designed to direct water away from the structure's core, preventing the kind of internal erosion that would cause catastrophic failure. This wasn't primitive construction. This was advanced engineering executed without any of the tools or theoretical frameworks we associate with monumental architecture. And then there's what stood on top. The summit platform measures roughly 5 acres, large enough to support substantial structures, and the archaeological evidence, though fragmentary, suggests something massive once crowned the mound. Post holes indicating wooden buildings, some with footprints suggesting structures up to 100 feet long. These would have been visible from anywhere in the city, from the outlying villages, from the river itself. Platforms rising above platforms, wooden temples or elite residences that would have dominated the skyline like nothing else in North America. Imagine approaching Cahokia for the first time. You're coming up the Mississippi in a canoe, or walking across the floodplain from an outlying village. The landscape is mostly flat, interrupted by dozens of smaller mounds, but your eye keeps getting drawn to the center, to this impossible mountain rising from the earth, terraced and massive, crowned with wooden structures that catch the sun. It would have been overwhelming. That was the point, because Monk's Mound wasn't just architecture. It was theology in physical form, the axis mundi, the cosmic mountain connecting earth to sky, the place where humans could approach the celestial realm. In Mississippian cosmology, the universe was layered, the underworld below, the earth in the middle, the sky world above. Sacred mountains, natural or artificial, were where those layers touched, where spiritual power could flow between realms. By building the largest sacred mountain in their known world, the Cahokians were making a statement about their place in the cosmic order. This wasn't just political power, though it was certainly that. This was religious authority on a scale that demanded acknowledgement. If you controlled the axis mundi, if you lived atop the sacred mountain, if you performed the rituals that maintained cosmic balance from that elevated platform, You weren't just a chief or king. You were something more, an intermediary between worlds, a figure who stood literally and symbolically between earth and heaven, and every person who looked up at that 100-foot pyramid, every visitor who arrived from distant regions, every child raised in its shadow, they all understood that message without needing it explained. But a mountain, even a sacred one, is only as powerful as the world it commands. Spread out at the base of Monk's Mound was that world, an enormous, deliberately flattened rectangle of open ground known today as the Grand Plaza. On a map it looks almost simple, like someone just left a big empty space in the middle of the city. In reality, it is one of the clearest pieces of evidence that Cahokia was not an accident of growth. It was a designed city. The Grand Plaza covers roughly 40 acres. Try to visualize that scale. Not a village green, not a little commons. We're talking about a public space larger than many modern city parks, a flat, open, engineered void carved out of a natural landscape that absolutely did not want to be that flat. The Mississippi floodplain is a subtle mess of swales, low spots, natural levees, and old river channels. Cahokia's builders looked at that uneven ground and decided it would not do. Archaeological cores show that to create the plaza, they didn't just scrape it level, they filled it. Low areas were packed with carefully placed layers of earth and debris, sometimes more than a meter deep, then capped and smoothed to create a single continuous plane. This wasn't just clear some brush and call it a square. This was earth moving on a civic scale. Thousands of basket loads again. Not for a towering monument this time, but for empty space. Space that could hold crowds, ceremonies, games, market stalls, processions. Space that could be seen, and seen across, from the summit of Monk's Mound, and from the tops of other platform mounds ringing the edges. Stand conceptually in the middle of that plaza and look around in all directions. The city rises around you, not randomly, but in deliberate patterns. Cahokia contained more than 120 earthen mounds, spread over at least 6 square miles. They weren't scattered like mole hills. They line up. Archaeologists have mapped alignments that run on cardinal directions and sight lines that point to major features. Some mounds anchor the corners of the Grand Plaza. Others form axial lines radiating away from Monk's Mound. When you overlay these on a modern grid, patterns emerge that are hard to explain as coincidence. And the mounds themselves were not all the same. Platform mounds, flat-topped, often rectilinear, supported buildings, council houses, temples, elite residences, ritual structures. These were the stages on which power was performed, lifted above ordinary ground. Conical mounds were more often burial places, rounding up toward the sky over the dead, sometimes containing high-status burials, sometimes whole sequences of interments layered over time. Ridge-top mounds, long and narrow with peaked profiles, seem to have marked boundaries, transitions, or particularly charged ritual spaces. One of them, Mound 72, would become infamous for the evidence of human sacrifice found within, but that's a story for later. Taken together, these varied mounds form a 3-dimensional map of Cahokian life. Governance here, ancestors there, cosmic drama everywhere. They imply a mental blueprint, a vision of how a city should look and feel, where sacred power should concentrate, and where everyday life should unfold, and that everyday life was anything but haphazard. Excavations across the site show clear evidence of planning at the neighborhood level. Rows of houses line up along consistent orientations, following something remarkably close to a grid. Not the rigid right-angled grid of a Roman camp or a modern subdivision, but a culturally tuned version of the same idea. Ordered space, repeated patterns, predictable relationships between one household and the next. Certain zones are dominated by dense clusters of domestic structures, residential districts. Other areas show concentrations of specialized debris, tons of broken stone from tool-making, piles of shell from bead production, traces of pottery kilns and workshops. These were craft production districts, where artisans shaped the raw materials pouring in from Cahokia's trade networks into the prestige goods that fueled its economy and rituals. Closer to Monk's Mound and the central plaza, architecture changes character. Houses become larger and more widely spaced. Palisade lines, large buildings and mounds create enclosed courtyards and restricted precincts. This inner core, sometimes called the central or elite precinct, seems to have been the realm of rulers, priests and high-ranking families. Access here would have been controlled. Processions from the outlying neighborhoods into this heart of the city would have dramatized social hierarchy in a way everyone could see. Separating that elite core from the rest of the city was one of Cahokia's most dramatic features, a stockade wall. Imagine a palisade nearly 2 miles long, built from thousands of upright logs, some over a foot in diameter, set shoulder to shoulder in a ditch, backfilled and braced. At intervals, archaeologists have found the footprints of bastions, projecting towers where guards could stand above the wall line, looking out over the city or the fields beyond. This wall encircled Monk's Mound, the Grand Plaza, and a cluster of high-status mounds and buildings, creating an inner sanctum within the already impressive city. The really telling detail isn't just that the stockade existed, it's that it was rebuilt, not once, but at least 4 times, each iteration following roughly the same course, each requiring another massive investment of labour and resources, cutting trees, hauling logs, redigging trenches, over and over. Why? The obvious answer is defence, protection from rival polities, raiders, or internal threats. A wall with bastions certainly looks military, but the wall's placement, enclosing the elite core rather than the entire urban sprawl, also suggests symbolism. This was a line between sacred and profane, ruler and ruled, centre and periphery. A visible statement that the heart of Cahokia was not for everyone, at least not all the time. Scholars debate the balance between these functions. Was the stockade primarily a fortification that just happened to align with social divisions, or primarily a ritual boundary that could double as a last line of defence? The best answer might be both. In Cahokia, as in many ancient cities, the lines between security system and cosmic architecture blur. Outside the wall, life packed in densely. Residential neighbourhoods consisted of single-family houses built with wattle and daub construction, wooden posts forming a frame, interwoven with branches and covered in a plaster of clay and organic material. Most were rectangular, oriented consistently, with thatched roofs sloping down over packed earth floors. These houses did not stand alone in random isolation. They clustered around small courtyards, often shared by several related households. Within these micro-communities you'd find storage pits dug into the ground, some lined or capped to keep out moisture and pests, holding maize, squash, nuts, and other staples. Trash pits, cooking hearths, and work areas filled the spaces between structures. Children would have grown up in tight webs of kin, surrounded by the constant buzz of conversation, craft, food preparation, and ritual. Between neighbourhoods there were wider paths or lanes, circulation routes that connected people to the central plaza and to each other. Communal spaces within districts likely hosted smaller-scale feasts, local ceremonies, dispute resolutions, the countless small acts that keep a city functioning day to day. When you assemble all of this, the Grand Plaza, the aligned mounds, the grid-like neighbourhoods, the specialised districts, the elite core wrapped in its palisade, you get a startling picture. This was not a loose agglomeration of huts clustering around a big sacred hill. It was a metropolis, designed and redesigned over centuries according to a shared understanding of how power, people, and the cosmos should be arranged. Around the same time, across the ocean, cities in Mesoamerica, in West Africa, in parts of Asia and Europe were experimenting with their own urban logics. Orthogonal streets, ceremonial avenues, walled citadels, segregated craft quarters. Cahokia belongs in that conversation. It wasn't behind, it was doing what cities everywhere do, turning ideas about order and meaning into physical form. The difference is that most of us were never taught to see it that way. But for all that planning on the ground, some of Cahokia's most important lines were drawn upward, into the sky. Walk west from Monk's Mound, past houses and smaller platforms, and you reach what, for a long time, just looked like a slightly odd patch of empty field. No towering earthwork, no dramatic ruin, nothing to announce itself. When highway construction and salvage archaeology swept through this area in the 1960s and 70s, what they found under the soil changed how we understand Cahokia's mind. Post holes, dozens of them, deep, regularly spaced, cut into the subsoil in broad arcs. When archaeologists mapped them, the pattern emerged. Not random fence lines or building footprints, but great circles, some more than 400 feet across, circles within circles, and at their centres a single massive post hole larger and deeper than the rest. They called it Woodhenge. The comparison to Stonehenge is superficial but useful. Like its English cousin, Woodhenge is a circle of uprights keyed to the movements of the sun. Instead of megaliths, Cahokia used timber, tree trunks a foot or more in diameter, sunk firmly into the ground and rising high enough that from the centre they would frame slices of the horizon. Now, imagine standing at that centre post just before dawn, your feet in the cool dirt, your breath white in the late winter air. Around you, a circle of dark wood uprights. Out on the eastern horizon, beyond the maze of houses and mounds, the first glow of sunrise. From this vantage point, certain posts line up precisely with where the sun rises on key days of the year. At the spring equinox, the sun comes up in the notch between two posts. At the summer solstice, it breaks the horizon just over the shoulder of another. At the winter solstice, it appears in a different, equally deliberate place. The same is true for sunset on those days, if you watch from the right position. This is not accidental. The posts were not tossed down any which way. Someone in Cahokia was tracking the sun's annual path with enough care to know exactly where, on that local horizon, it would appear at the turning points of the agricultural and ceremonial year, and then converting that knowledge into wood and earth. The largest of these circles, often called Woodhenge III, was about 410 feet in diameter and contained 48 posts plus the central marker. Earlier circles were smaller, with fewer posts. Later ones added more. Archaeologists have identified at least 5 distinct versions, built and rebuilt over roughly 2 centuries. Posts were pulled out, holes were filled, new holes were cut in slightly different positions. This wasn't just routine maintenance on a sacred structure. It looks a lot like iteration. Think of Woodhenge as a scientific instrument, an enormous community-scale device for measuring time. Every year, priests or timekeepers could stand at the centre, note the exact point of sunrise, and compare it to the known positions. If the sun seemed a little off, if the timing of the seasons drifted relative to their markers, they had options. Adjust the calendar, or, over generations, adjust the posts. Every rebuild refined the system, slightly different diameters, more posts to mark more days or more celestial events, perhaps different vantage points calibrated to changes elsewhere in the city. Woodhenge grew with Cahokia, tracking not just the heavens but the city's evolving sense of order. What did that mean for everyday life? If you rely heavily on maize agriculture, as Cahokia did, Knowing when to plant and when to expect the first frosts is the difference between surplus and starvation. In temperate climates, the seasons don't always respect the calendar in your head. Clouds obscure the sky. Weather is noisy. The solstices and equinoxes, by contrast, are fixed astronomical realities. Tie your agricultural cycle to those and you have an anchor. So Woodhenge was, in a very practical sense, an agricultural clock, but it was also a theatre. On key mornings, spring equinox, summer solstice, fall equinox, winter solstice, hundreds or thousands of people might gather around the circle. Out of the pre-dawn gloom, processions could arrive from the city, elites from the central precinct, commoners from the neighbourhoods, delegations from outlying towns. At the centre, a priest or ruler takes their place. Silence falls, the horizon brightens, and then, on cue, the sun rises exactly between the appointed posts. If you're standing in that crowd, that looks like power. Not power in the abstract, but power over time itself. The person at the centre knows when the sun will appear, where it will appear, and can dramatise that knowledge in front of everyone. They're not just political leaders. They're calendar keepers, cosmic intermediaries. Their authority is grounded, literally, in the alignment between wood, earth, and sky. This is where Cahokia stops looking like a city with some rituals and starts looking like a society that studied the heavens systematically. To build and maintain Woodhenge, you need long-term observation records. You need designated roles, people whose job it is to watch the sunrise, note its position, track its drift. You need conceptual categories like east, west, north, and south that aren't just useful directions but sacred orientations. Across the broader Mississippian world, you see variations on the same cosmology, a four-direction universe, a layered cosmos with an upper world, a middle earth, and a watery underworld below, often symbolized by a vertical axis, a world tree or sacred pole, connecting them. The sun is a powerful being in that universe, a traveller whose predictable journey ties the human world to the divine. Woodhenge fits that pattern perfectly. The central post becomes the axis, the world tree. The circle of posts becomes the ordered horizon. The rising sun moves through that framework, confirming day after day that the world is still behaving according to the expected rules. And in that confirmation lies legitimacy. If the sun keeps arriving where the priests say it will, on the days they proclaim, it reinforces the idea that their rituals keep the cosmos in balance. If a drought strikes or the seasons feel out of joint, the pressure on those timekeepers intensifies. Have they angered the spirits, miscounted the days, failed to perform the correct rites? Astronomical specialists in Cahokia probably lived in that tension. Part scientist, part priest, part bureaucrat of time, they translated celestial patterns into social schedules. When to start clearing fields, when to host communal feasts, when to stage renewal ceremonies, when to declare wars or treaties auspicious. Their power was quiet but immense. If they said the solstice was coming, the city moved. Fields were planted, offerings were made, crowds assembled, leaders mounted the mounds. Time itself for Cahokia was not an abstract grid of numbered days, but a lived sequence of ritual markers keyed to the sun's path, markers laid out in wood and watched with disciplined attention. So when we look at those circles today, just patterns of darker soil in an excavated pit map, it's easy to underestimate what we're seeing. Not just a ring of posts, not just America's Stonehenge as a catchy nickname. We're seeing proof that the people of Cahokia were not only capable of building a metropolis of Earth, they were also capable of building a calendar in timber, an observatory big enough for an entire community to stand inside, and subtle enough to keep their worlds synchronized with the sky. And that synchronization, that belief that city, soil, and cosmos should all line up, would have consequences in places far more intimate and far more unsettling than a sunrise ceremony in a wooden circle. That belief that the city should line up with the cosmos didn't stay abstract. It got written into bodies and buried in the earth. Walk a little southeast from Monk's Mound, away from the neat geometry of the Grand Plaza and the measured circles of Woodhenge, and you hit a low, unremarkable rise the early archaeologists numbered Mound 72. For decades, it looked like nothing special, a small ridgetop mound, partly shaved down by ploughs, overgrown with grass, not the kind of thing that screams, "This is where the real story is." Then they started digging. What they found under that modest hill is maybe the single most disturbing, most revealing window we have into Cahokia's inner life. Because Mound 72 is not just a burial, it's a statement about power. At the heart of the mound, in a carefully prepared pit, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a man, about 40 years old, laid out on top of something that, at first, didn't make sense. A thick layer of marine shell beads, tens of thousands of them, spread under and around his body, not just dumped in a pile but arranged. When they mapped the bead pattern, a shape emerged, wings outstretched, tail extended, head turned. A stylized bird, a falcon. The man wasn't just buried with wealth. He was lying on a falcon-shaped blanket of shell, as if his body and this bird form were fused into one. If you know anything about Mississippian iconography, that hits like a bolt of lightning. Across the later Mississippian world, from engraved shell gorgets in Tennessee to copper plates in Oklahoma, you see a recurring figure, a warrior or hero with bird-like features, feathered cap, taloned feet, sometimes wings. Archaeologists call him the Birdman. In some native oral traditions, he echoes powerful beings like Redhorn, a heroic but also dangerous figure who moves between worlds. Mound 72's central burial looks a lot like the earliest, grandest version of that idea made flesh. Around this falcon man, the pit was packed with grave goods, long spear points, finely crafted artifacts, another individual, possibly a companion or subordinate, placed nearby. The shell beads themselves tell a story. They're marine shells from the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic, brought inland through long-distance trade, then drilled and shaped by specialists. 20,000 of them means years of labour, hundreds of hands. Whoever this man was, Cahokia mobilized enormous resources to send him into the next world as a bird of prey. But the falcon burial is only one layer. As excavations continued, archaeologists realized Mound 72 wasn't a single event. It was a stacked, complicated mortuary complex built up over time. Multiple burial pits, multiple episodes, over 270 individuals in total. Some were elite-looking, like the central figure. 2 men laid head-to-head on a bed of high-status artifacts. Others were different, disturbingly uniform. One pit held the remains of more than 50 young women, most in their late teens or early 20s, laid out in orderly rows, 2 deep. Another grave contained more women, similarly aged, similarly arranged. Their skeletons didn't show battle wounds. Instead, many displayed signs consistent with simultaneous death, no long-term healing, no evidence of life after trauma. In some cases, there were suggestions of strangulation or blood loss. Nearby, another mass burial held over 40 individuals who appear to have been killed and dumped in a more chaotic way, some showing signs of being bound. This doesn't look like a cemetery for people who just happen to die around the same time. It looks like human sacrifice. Not sacrifice in the Hollywood sense with stone altars and chanting cliches, but something colder and more systemic. Groups of people, often young women, selected, killed within a short window, and interred as part of a ritual program centered on a few hyper-privileged dead. So who was that man on the falcon? No one can say for sure, but the theories cluster around a few possibilities. 1. He was a paramount chief, a ruler at the apex of Cahokia's hierarchy. In this reading, Mound 72 is his mortuary monument. The falcon imagery marks him as a warrior king tied to the upper world of sun and sky. The sacrificed retainers, especially the rows of young women, are there to accompany and serve him in death, as in life. 2. He was part of a myth enacted in real time. The burial might be a ritual reenactment of a founding story, a birdman or red-horn figure whose death and rebirth structured Cahokia's universe. In that case, the sacrificed individuals are not random victims but chosen participants in a living myth, their death seen as necessary to renew the world. 3. He was more than a ruler, he was being turned into a god. The falcon form under his body, the concentration of wealth, the mass graves around him could signal an attempt to literally embed a deified person into the landscape. Monk's mound for the living ruler, Mound 72 for the apotheosized dead. Whichever interpretation you lean toward, the implications are hard to escape. Cahokia was not just a city of farmers and astronomer priests calmly tracking the seasons. It was also a place where some people had the power to decide that dozens of others would die for a burial program, where ideology and cosmology could be invoked to justify lethal, large-scale rituals. This forces an uncomfortable recalibration. We like to imagine pre-Columbian North America as either untouched wilderness or peaceful villages. Cahokia breaks both images. Here was a dense, complex society with monumental architecture, far-flung trade, and enough hierarchy and coercive power to orchestrate mass death in the name of cosmic order. At the same time, Mound 72 is not unique in world history. If you zoom out, similar patterns appear again and again when small-scale societies scale up. The royal tombs of Ur in ancient Mesopotamia with their sacrificed attendants, the retainer burials of early dynastic Egypt, Shang dynasty pits in China filled with beheaded captives, the heart-offering rituals of later Mesoamerican states. Across continents, early state-level societies often tie political power to dramatic displays of life and death control. Ritual sacrifice in that context becomes a kind of theatre of sovereignty. It says, our leaders are so connected to the gods, so central to the order of the world, that human lives can and must be spent to keep that order intact. Cahokia, it seems, was part of that global pattern. But knowing that doesn't make Mound 72 easier to sit with, especially for the descendants of the people who built it. Many native nations today trace cultural, linguistic, or ancestral ties back to the Mississippian world. Tribes like the Osage, the Otto-Missouria, the Ho-Chunk, the Choctaw, and others. For them, Cahokia isn't just an archaeological puzzle, it's family history. Modern indigenous scholars and community leaders approach sites like Mound 72 with a double responsibility. On one hand, there's a deep commitment to honour the dead, to treat burial grounds with the same respect you'd give to a contemporary cemetery. On the other, there's a push to reclaim the narrative from centuries of racist dismissal and sensationalism. When human sacrifice at Cahokia is discussed today, it's often framed carefully, not as evidence of savagery, but as a complex, historically specific set of practices in a society grappling with power, belief, and risk at a massive scale. Some indigenous voices emphasize that we shouldn't flatten these ancestors into either noble innocents or bloodthirsty tyrants. They were people, making choices, sometimes beautiful, sometimes horrifying, inside the constraints of their own world. Archaeologists, too, have become more cautious. Early reports on Mound 72 leaned into shock value. Later work, often in collaboration with native communities, tries to balance honest description with cultural sensitivity, acknowledging the violence without turning it into spectacle, recognizing that for some listeners, these aren't remains, they're relatives. So Mound 72 sits there under its layer of grass as a kind of moral fault line. On one side, or at the artistry of the shell-bead falcon, the long-distance trade that fed it, the elaborate choreography of ritual and construction. On the other side, unease at the knowledge that behind all that splendor were real human beings whose lives were cut short, likely without much choice. And yet, if we want to understand Cahokia in full, not as a sanitized symbol, but as a real city that rose and ruled and fell, we can't look away from this mound. Because in its tangled layers of bones and beads and arranged bodies, we see the sharpest outline of a society willing to do almost anything to keep its world aligned. City to sky, ruler to cosmos, sacrifice to power. The question is how far those alignments could stretch before they began to tear the fabric of Cahokia itself. If Mound 72 shows us how far Cahokia's leaders would go to concentrate power, the next question is, where did that power reach? Because Cahokia wasn't an isolated miracle sprouting out of cornfields. It sat at the center of a web. Start with the simplest evidence, stuff that obviously doesn't belong there. In the elite burials and ritual pits around the site, archaeologists keep finding copper, hammered, shaped, sometimes cut into thin sheets or decorative plates, but not just any copper. Chemical signatures trace much of it back to the Great Lakes, hundreds of miles to the north. That means somebody was hauling heavy metal out of distant mines or surface deposits, moving it down rivers, passing it hand to hand until it reached the mounds. In the same layers there are marine shell beads made from whelks and other sea creatures that live in the Gulf of Mexico and along the Atlantic seaboard. No oceans near St. Louis. Those shells travelled, carried up the Mississippi, up its tributaries through dozens of communities, each of which probably took a cut, added value, or passed them along as part of diplomatic exchanges. Then there's stone. Not just any random cobbles pulled from a stream, but fine cherts and flints with distinct geological fingerprints. Some trace back to Oklahoma, others to quarries in Arkansas, Missouri, or farther east. Mica, the glittering, flaky mineral sometimes found in Mississippian ritual contexts, points to the Appalachian region. In a world without wheels, without horses, this material didn't arrive by accident. It moved because people wanted it to move, and because Cahokia was important enough that distant groups considered it worth the effort. Lay all those sources on a map and you don't just see lines of trade. You see the outline of a world. Archaeologists call it the Mississippian world, a loose cultural universe stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf, from the plains of Oklahoma to the Atlantic forests. Not a single empire with borders and bureaucracy, but a patchwork of towns, villages, and chiefdoms that shared certain ways of building, believing, and organizing life. At the heart of that patchwork, especially in the 11th and 12th centuries, sits Cahokia. It's tempting to picture this like a medieval European capital. Cahokia as Paris, New York, or Beijing, sending out orders, demanding tribute. The reality was almost certainly messier. But when you zoom out, a pattern emerges. Around the time Cahokia booms, a distinctive set of ideas and objects begins spreading across the eastern half of North America, showing up at sites that had never seen anything like them before. You can think of it as the Cahokian cultural package. There's the pottery. One particular style, Ramey incised, becomes a kind of signature. These are thin, carefully made pots with complex, often swirling incise designs. The motifs sometimes echo broader Mississippian cosmology, cross-and-circle patterns, nested lines, possible references to water, sky, or the layered structure of the universe. When Ramey incised vessels or close imitations pop up far from Cahokia, it's like finding shards of imported porcelain in a medieval village. Somebody had connections. There are the mounds themselves. Platform mounds, Flat-topped earthen structures for temples, council houses, or elite residences are not invented entirely at Cahokia, but during its heyday, that architectural style proliferates. Towns that had never built big earthen monuments suddenly start reshaping their landscapes, raising central plazas, aligning buildings around cardinal directions, stacking soil into artificial hills for the houses of the powerful. There are the icons, certain motifs, raptors, forked eyes, weeping or flaming eye symbols, crosses, hand and eye designs, begin to appear over and over on carved shell, copper plate, stone and pottery from Georgia to Oklahoma. Later archaeologists bundle many of these into what they call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, a visual vocabulary of power, warfare, fertility and cosmic order. Cahokia looks like one of the earliest, densest nodes in that iconographic explosion. And then there's a game. If you dig at Cahokia, you find dozens of carefully shaped stone discs, usually a few inches across, sometimes polished smooth, sometimes with a groove cut around the edge. They're chunky stones, made for one of the most widespread and, in its own way, influential activities in the Mississippian world. The rules, as far as we can reconstruct them, were simple but high stakes. A player would roll the stone across a cleared field. As it sped away, other players hurled spears or staff-like javelins, trying to land as close as possible to where the disc would stop. Add betting, ritual, maybe even divination, reading outcomes as signs from the spirit world, and you've got something that's more than just recreation. Chunky wasn't confined to Cahokia. Those same discs show up at Mississippian sites across the continent. Some later historic accounts from southeastern tribes describe public games drawing huge crowds, with political leaders watching or even participating, and spectators wagering heavily on the outcome. It's not hard to imagine Chunky functioning as a kind of social glue and pressure valve, a way to forge alliances, settle disputes, or redistribute wealth without open conflict. When you see chunky stones in a distant village, alongside platform mounds and Cahokia-style pottery, you're not just seeing fashion. You're seeing the imprint of a larger world radiating out of the Mississippi Valley. Sometimes that imprint is so strong it raises an uncomfortable question. Where does influence end and colony begin? Take Aztalan in southern Wisconsin. Today it's a state park with reconstructed palisades and mounds along the Crawfish River. In the 11th and 12th centuries, it was a fortified community with platform mounds, a central plaza, and material culture that looks strikingly Cahokian. There's evidence of maize agriculture, ritual deposits, and long-distance trade. Some researchers see Aztalan as a local society adopting Mississippian styles on its own terms. Others argue it might have been a true outpost, a northern node planted, staffed, or at least heavily guided by people from the Cahokia heartland. Even more intriguing is Trempealeau, further upstream along the Mississippi in western Wisconsin. There, on a bluff overlooking the river, archaeologists have uncovered a small cluster of platform mounds and a footprint that doesn't match the local woodland traditions at all. The ceramics, layout, and construction techniques look early Cahokian, like someone picked up a chunk of the city's playbook and dropped it hundreds of miles away. What was Trempealeau? A pilgrimage station, a seasonal ritual camp, a trading enclave where Cahokian emissaries met with northern partners, a short-lived colony that burned out after a generation or two? The evidence is tantalizing but thin. Charcoal dating and artifact styles say strong Cahokia connection, but they can't tell us whether the people who built those mounds were migrants, missionaries, merchants, or some combination. And that's the frustrating, fascinating limit of archaeology. We can follow the copper from Lake Superior into Cahokia's elite burials. We can trace shell beads from the Gulf into falcon-shaped blankets under powerful men. We can map the spread of Ramey incist pottery, chunky stones, and platform mounds like a cultural weather radar. We can say with some confidence that Cahokia sat at the centre of a continent-scale network of exchange and imitation. But why did people join that network? What exactly were they getting and giving in return? Was Cahokia a military power, sending warriors up and down the rivers to enforce its will? Possibly, but hard evidence of organised, long-distance warfare tied directly to the city is thin. Was it an economic magnet, a place where rare goods and information pooled, drawing in ambitious leaders from far-flung towns? That seems likely. Was it a religious centre, a kind of middle Mississippian Mecca, where people came on pilgrimage, received sacred knowledge, and carried new rituals home? The answer might be all of the above, shifting over time. Power in the Mississippian world probably didn't divide neatly into economic, religious, and political, the way we like to categorize it. A chief who controlled access to exotic copper also controlled the making of sacred regalia, also claimed a special relationship with the spirits, also hosted big feasts where alliances were cemented and chunky stones rolled across the plaza. Trade, ritual, and authority were intertwined. What we can say is this. When Cahokia rose, it pulled a huge swathe of North America into its orbit, not by erasing local traditions, but by overlaying them with a shared set of symbols, games, building styles, and high-status goods. For a couple of centuries, if you lived anywhere from Wisconsin to Georgia, you were living in a world that had, in some way, been touched by Cahokia. Inside the city, that meant more mouths to feed, more crafts to make, more obligations to meet, because every network that brings wealth and prestige into a centre also brings strain. To see how people actually lived inside that pressure cooker, what they ate, what they made, how they spent their days, we have to zoom back in, from the continental web to the packed neighbourhoods around the mounds. If you could drop into Cahokia at its height and walk a circuit from the riverfront up toward Monk's Mound, you wouldn't see a mystic city of pure ritual first. You'd see food. Rows of maize fields stretch away from the core, not random gardens, but managed landscapes. Corn wasn't native here. It had travelled north over centuries, slowly adapted to shorter growing seasons. By the time Cahokia takes off, maize has become the staple, so central that in a sense the city is built out of corn. But it's not just maize. This is where the story gets deeper than the textbook corn and beans cliché. Long before full-blown maize agriculture, people in this region had domesticated a suite of native plants, what archaeologists call the Eastern Agricultural Complex. Goosefoot with its tiny starchy seeds, maygrass, little barley, sunflower, bred for larger seeds and oil, squash, not just for eating but for containers and drying racks. Cahokia doesn't abandon those plants when corn arrives. It layers maize on top of an older, local tradition of cultivation. Imagine households tending small plots of goosefoot and sunflower closer to home, while communal fields of maize lie a bit farther out, organised at the neighbourhood or community level. The combination creates caloric surplus on a scale no previous society in the region could match. Enough not just to feed a town, but to support thousands of people who don't spend their days in the fields at all. Those are the specialists. Archaeologists can literally map craft neighbourhoods across the site. In one area, excavations turn up piles of broken shell, half-finished beads, drills worn to nubs, shell bead workshops, places where artisans took whelk and other marine shells hauled up from the Gulf and carved them into tiny uniform cylinders. Thread enough of those onto fibre and you get belts, sashes, cloaks that glitter in the sun, currency and regalia rolled into one. In another district, the ground is littered with chert flakes, cores and rejects. Flint knappers sat there day after day, striking stone with antler or bone, coaxing long, thin blades and standardized projectile points out of carefully prepared cores. Some areas seem almost industrial, production not just for one household, but for distribution across the city and maybe beyond. Closer to the core, you find evidence of pottery production. Dump sites thick with misfired sherds, clay pits, the ghostly outlines of kilns. Cahokian potters weren't just making utilitarian jars. They were producing fine wares like Ramey insist, with thin walls and complex designs that required skill and practice. That kind of consistency doesn't happen if everyone's improvising. It suggests apprenticeship, standards, maybe even something like quality control. And then there's copper. There's no smelting here, they're not extracting metal from ore. But when raw copper arrives as nuggets or rough sheets from the Great Lakes, Cahokian metal workers hammer it cold, anneal it in fire, hammer it again. The result, embossed plates, headdresses, beads and ornaments. These workshops leave behind tiny punched-out circles, slivers, and distinctive hammer marks. Always, tellingly, closer to elite precincts than to common neighbourhoods. Put all of this together, and you start to see an economy humming beneath the mounds. Farmers, full-time craftspeople, part-time specialists, labour crews rotating between fields, building projects, and workshops. A city where not everyone is doing the same thing, and where your daily life is shaped by your role in that system. We can even reconstruct what people were putting into their bodies. When archaeologists analyse the chemical signatures in Cahokian bones, especially the ratios of certain carbon and nitrogen isotopes, they keep finding the same pattern. A heavy, almost overwhelming reliance on maize. In life, that means tortillas, porridges, gruels, ground corn baked on hot stones, boiled in clay pots, thickened into stews. The picture isn't all corn, though. Animal bones from trash pits tell their own story. White-tailed deer remains are everywhere. Meat, marrow, hides. Fish bones and scales mark the importance of the river. Catfish, gar, drum. In migration seasons, flocks of waterfowl and other birds would have filled the sky, and their bones show up too. Turtles, occasional bear, small mammals, and a wide variety of wild plant remains, nuts, berries, seeds, round out the diet. For elites, the pattern nudges in a different direction. High-status burials sometimes show more animal protein, more variety, and access to special foods and drinks. Some pits hint at feasting, massive dumps of bones, broken serving vessels, remains of meals far larger than a normal household would eat. Commoners, in contrast, seem to have eaten more monotonous, corn-heavy diets, with less frequent access to prime cuts. You can see the consequences in their skeletons. Many children's teeth show enamel hyperplasias, lines and pits that record bouts of malnutrition or serious illness. Adult bones reveal high rates of arthritis and repetitive stress injuries, the mark of heavy physical labour. There's evidence of anemia and other deficiencies, likely linked to a diet leaning too hard on maize without enough complementary foods. Elites, buried with exotic goods and carefully arranged, often show fewer of these stress markers, better stature, and slightly better overall health. Food and craft, in other words, are not just economic facts, they're social divisions carved into bone. Now layer that onto the sensory world of the city. As you approach the core, the smell hits first. Wood smoke from hundreds, maybe thousands of small hearths curling into the air. The rich, earthy scent of wet soil and trampled thatch. In warm months, the sour, sweet odour of fermenting foods, human waste and refuse pits, managed but never completely hidden. You hear the constant clatter of daily life. Stone striking stone in the napping yards, the rapid tap-tap of shell being drilled into beads, the dull thud of wooden mortars as women and children grind maize into meal, dogs barking, children shouting, playing, maybe rolling chunky stones in miniature games that mirror the ones played on the plaza. Market areas, probably set along walkways or at the edges of plazas, would be crowded on certain days, people arriving from outlying hamlets with baskets of surplus maize, squash, nuts, smoked meat. Others offering finished goods, pots, beads, stone tools, woven mats. Deals struck not with coins but with negotiation, obligation, and memory. You don't just buy, you reinforce relationships. Housing mirrors this hierarchy and intensity. Most Cahokians lived in relatively small rectangular houses, wattle and daub walls, thatched roofs, clustered around courtyards. These neighbourhoods have shared storage pits, middens and workspaces. Closer to major mounds, structures get larger, sometimes arranged in more formal compounds, with thicker walls or special features. Some archaeologists interpret these as elite residences or ritual buildings. The distribution of exotic goods, copper, marine shell, finely incised pottery, skews heavily toward those central areas. From the outskirts, Cahokia might feel like a dense, smoky, hard-working town. From the top of Monk's Mound, it's a carefully organized hierarchy of space. The powerful literally elevated, their houses and temples on artificial hills, while commoners' homes spread out below, graded by proximity and privilege. Feeding that whole system put enormous pressure on the land. To build dozens of mounds and a massive central plaza, you need staggering amounts of earth. To clear that earth, to cook food for thousands, to fire pottery and heat homes through cold winters, you need wood. Lots of it. Pollen and charcoal records from around Cahokia suggest intense deforestation during its peak centuries. Forests near the city get thinned, then pushed back. As trees disappear, erosion worsens. Rain falls on bare or overworked fields, and soil washes into low-lying areas. Floods, always a risk in a big river valley, may have become more frequent or more destructive as wetlands are drained and floodplains are reshaped. Intensive maize agriculture can also exhaust soil if it's not allowed to rest. There's evidence that fields were pushed farther and farther out as close-in land lost fertility. That means longer trips for farmers, more labour, more vulnerability if weather turns bad. In trash pits and house floors from later phases of the city, some archaeologists see hints of strain, more signs of malnutrition, more crowded living conditions, more evidence of hastily repaired or repurposed structures. It's as if the system is riding the edge, still impressive, still powerful, but increasingly costly for the people at the bottom. And yet, for those living inside it, daily life might have felt normal. You plant in spring, tend fields in summer, help with a building project when called, spend slack seasons in workshops or markets, watch games in the plaza, attend rituals on the mounds. You navigate obligations to family, neighbours, and chiefs. You try to keep your children fed. From a distance of centuries, we see the fragility built into that rhythm. The deforested hills, the taxed soils, the social inequalities etched into bone. Inside the city, it just feels like the way the world is. But that world was not going to last forever. The same forces that allowed Cahokia to explode, the maize surplus, the concentrated power, the environmental gamble, were setting up the conditions for its fall. By around the year 1200, you can feel something shift. On the surface, Cahokia is still monumental. Monk's Mound still dominates the horizon. Rituals still mark the solstices. The plaza is still a theatre for power. But if you zoom out over a couple of generations, the demographic curve that once shot upward starts to bend, then sag. Archaeologists track this not with census records, but with trash. Earlier centuries leave thick, widespread layers of debris, broken pots, animal bones, food waste, across huge swathes of the site. After about 1200, those layers thin out in the core and intensify in some outlying areas. New house constructions inside the old heart of the city become less frequent. By 1350 to 1400, What had been a dense urban centre is mostly empty earth and decaying structures, with only scattered smaller communities hanging on. Population estimates are slippery, but the pattern is clear enough. A boom through the thousands and 1100s, then a long, uneven decline. By the time Europeans arrive in the Mississippi Valley centuries later, Cahokia is not a living city. It's a memory turning into a myth. So what happened? One cluster of answers starts with the land itself. Remember the deforestation, the expanding fields, the erosion creeping into the lowlands. Those weren't temporary blips. They were baked into how the city functioned. Sediment cores from nearby lakes and floodplains show a spike in erosion and land disturbance during Cahokia's peak, followed by major flooding events. Around 1200, the record points to a particularly severe flood. Picture this. The river, swollen by heavy rains and runoff from deforested hills, surging out of its banks and pouring into low-lying areas that had been turned into fields and neighbourhoods. We can't say every district drowned, but there's clear evidence that some parts of the surrounding landscape were hit hard. If your city is built on the gamble that floodplains can be managed, a catastrophic flood is more than a bad year. It's a shock to the system. Fields get buried in silt or scoured clean. Storage pits are ruined. Houses near the river are damaged or destroyed. People who are already pushing limits now face the loss of both homes and harvests. At the same time, broader climate patterns may have been turning against them. Cahokia's heyday lines up with a period climatologists call the medieval climate anomaly, centuries of relatively warm conditions that, in some regions, meant more reliable growing seasons, but it wasn't stable everywhere. In many parts of North America, the centuries after 1200 see increasing climate variability, more pronounced droughts, sudden swings between wet and dry. Tree ring records from the broader Midwest suggest bouts of serious drought in the 1200s and 1300s. Now take a landscape already stressed by deforestation and soil exhaustion and drop repetitive dry spells onto it. Maize, which made Cahokia possible, becomes a liability. It's high yield in good years, punishing in bad ones. You can buffer this with storage and diversity, but only to a point. So one scenario goes like this: flood, then drought, then more unstable seasons. Fields already pushed to their limits don't bounce back. Farmers are forced to clear even more marginal land, walk even farther, invest more labour just to break even. Some years they don't. But environmental strain alone doesn't explain how a city unravels. It shapes the stage. People write the script. As resources get tighter, the social bargain at the core of Cahokia, labour and loyalty in exchange for security, ritual and order, comes under pressure. The archaeological record hints that inequality, always present, becomes sharper in the later phases. Elite compounds still show access to exotic goods and better diets, even as commoners' skeletons record rising stress, more enamel defects, more signs of chronic illness, more stunted growth in children. If you're working harder on poorer land while watching feasts and rituals continue on the mounds, the legitimacy of that elevated class is no longer a given. Some researchers see signs that political authority itself starts to fracture. Monument building slows. Certain mounds are modified or reused in ways that suggest changing agendas, maybe new factions. At the same time, you get another ominous signal. The city walls keep getting rebuilt. Cahokia was ringed, at its height, by a massive palisade. Tens of thousands of logs set upright, enclosing the central precinct. That wall wasn't a one-time construction. Archaeologists can trace multiple episodes where it's torn down or decays, then rebuilt, sometimes on a slightly different line. You don't rebuild a fortification like that for fun. Each reconstruction represents a substantial mobilization of labor and timber. It suggests recurring perceptions of threat, from outside enemies, from internal unrest, or both. And there is blood in the bones. Skeletal remains from Cahokia and nearby sites show an uptick in trauma in later periods. Skull fractures, embedded projectile points, cut marks consistent with violent encounters. Some burials appear to be mass interments of people who died at the same time, with injuries that look less like accidents and more like conflict. We can't stitch this into a neat narrative of specific battles or rebellions, but the pattern matches a society under increasing strain. Environmental shocks make resources scarce. Scarcity sharpens inequalities. Inequalities undermine trust in leaders. Lost trust makes conflict more likely. Conflict in turn disrupts production, trade, and ritual, feeding back into the original problem. Layer onto that a creeping health crisis. In the earlier boom, maize plus diverse native crops plus game and fish could support rapid population growth. But as density rises and diets tilt ever more heavily toward corn, the downsides compound. Maize is calorie-rich, but without careful supplementation, leaves people vulnerable to deficiencies. Overcrowded conditions make it easier for infectious diseases to spread. In later Cahokia, skeletal evidence points to more tuberculosis-like lesions, more signs of respiratory disease, more markers of chronic infection. Children's bones especially show stress from repeated illness and poor nutrition. Imagine living in a neighborhood where the soil is tired, the firewood is farther away, the water is sometimes suspect, and disease sweeps through every few years. You're still being called up for labor projects. You're still expected to participate in rituals that justify the social order. At some point, the question becomes unavoidable. Why stay? This is where the idea of collapse can mislead. Cahokia doesn't vanish overnight in a blaze of conquest. There's no single smoking gun catastrophe that wipes it off the map. The more we learn, the more the end looks like a long, uneven process of people opting out. Families, lineages, entire neighborhoods may have decided at different moments that the costs of living at the center outweighed the benefits. Some moved to nearby upland areas, where smaller mound centers and villages continue after Cahokia's decline. Others likely followed river routes outward, joining or founding communities that would later be known as ancestors of groups like the Illinois, Osage, Quapaw, and many others. In that sense, Cahokia doesn't just fall, it dissolves, its population reabsorbed into a wider landscape of towns and tribes. The city's political experiment ends, but its people, stories, and practices don't simply disappear. They flow into new configurations, leaving behind mounds and plazas as the empty shells of a former way of organizing life. When you try to pin this whole process on one cause, flood, drought, warfare, disease, you run into contradictions. The flood alone doesn't explain the timing. Climate shifts alone don't account for the specific social changes we see. Inequality and conflict by themselves can't topple a city without environmental context. Disease outbreaks get worse in crowded, stressed populations, but they also depend on all those other factors. The most convincing picture is messy, a cascade. Environmental degradation makes the system brittle. A major flood hits. Then a run of bad seasons tied to broader climate shifts. Harvests falter, nutritional stress rises, disease finds an opening, the social contract frays, violence and insecurity spread, leaders lose their aura of control. People in ones and twos and whole kin groups decide they're done investing in a city that no longer pays off. From the vantage point of centuries later, this looks like disappearance. From inside it, it might have felt like an extended, painful negotiation with reality, one in which the final answer was to walk away. And those who walked didn't just leave ruins behind. They carried things with them, memories of mounds, stories of a great city, design ideas, religious symbols, political lessons. Traces of Cahokia echo in later Mississippian sites across the southeastern Midwest, in art styles, settlement patterns, and cosmologies. To find the people of Cahokia after the city empties, you have to stop staring at the abandoned mounds and start following those echoes. If you only look at the empty mounds, it's easy to reach for the laziest explanation in the history playbook. They vanished. But people don't vanish. Populations move, split, merge, rename themselves, get renamed by others. Political centres die. Lineages don't. The story that Cahokia disappeared really just means this. By the time Europeans and their records show up, the specific city-state centred on those mounds is gone. What's left is harder to see. Cultural DNA scattered across a continent. Start with the people who, in their own stories, remember coming from that direction. West of Cahokia, in what is now Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Kansas, you find nations like the Osage, Omaha, Ponca, Quapaw, and Kansa. Groups linguists grouped together as Dagiya-Siouan speakers. Their languages are closely related, like branches on a fairly recent family tree. Their oral histories tell of migrations down the Ohio and Mississippi valleys from a homeland to the east. In some Osage and Quapaw traditions, that homeland is not just vaguely east. It's tied to big rivers, to mounds, to a powerful centre that organised life on a grand scale. Not a one-to-one GPS precise label saying we built Cahokia. Oral tradition doesn't work like that. But a remembered world that looks suspiciously like the Mississippian heartland. One version of the Degiha story runs like this. A larger ancestral group, living near the confluence of great rivers, splits into factions. They move downriver and upriver at different times. The Quapaw, downstream people, follow the Mississippi south. Others, like the Omaha and Ponca, bend north and west onto the plains. The Osage settle in the Ozark region, still within striking distance of the old centre but no longer beholden to it. Map those memories onto the archaeology, and a pattern emerges. As Cahokia declines, new or revitalised mound towns appear along the same river corridors those stories describe. Not as gigantic as Cahokia, but clearly infused with the same ideas. Platform mounds aligned to cardinal directions, plazas for ceremony and politics, iconography that echoes Cahokia's art. It's as if families, clans, whole communities took pieces of the civic blueprint with them and rebuilt it to scale in their new homes. And this doesn't just happen in one direction. To the south and southeast, Mississippian culture blooms in a constellation of powerful chiefdoms. Moundville in present-day Alabama, Etowah in Georgia, Spiro in eastern Oklahoma, each with its own history, its own leaders, its own versions of the shared iconography. But look closely and you can see Cahokia's shadow. At Moundville, a ring of platform mounds encloses a central plaza, much like the arrangement around Cahokia's Grand Plaza, but compressed, more tightly choreographed. At Etowah, you find intricately carved stone and shell artworks covered in the same motifs that show up on Cahokian artifacts. Falcon warriors, underworld creatures, cosmic axes splitting sky and earth. At Spiro, a single mound yields a treasure trove of sacred objects, copper plates, shell gorgets, wooden sculptures that bear an unmistakable Mississippian visual language. No one can say with absolute certainty whether Cahokia directly founded these places, or whether they and Cahokia drew on a shared religious and political tradition that radiated out along trade and marriage networks. But in terms of cultural fingerprints, the resemblance is too strong to shrug off. When the first Europeans push into this world, they don't find an empty landscape of lost civilizations. They run straight into Cahokia's heirs. In the 1540s, Hernando de Soto marches a Spanish expedition through the southeast, leaving a wake of violence, kidnapping and disease. His chroniclers describe dense towns ruled by powerful chiefs, some perched on or beside earthen mounds. They're hosted in plazas, presented with elaborate gifts, drawn into rituals they barely understand. These are late Mississippian polities, cousins in a broad sense of Cahokia. A century later, French explorers like Marquette and Joliet paddle down the Mississippi. They pass abandoned mounds, yes, but also thriving indigenous towns and fields. Marquette sketches a map that marks ancient works near the confluence of the Mississippi and Illinois rivers, almost certainly the Cahokia complex, and notes living nations all around them: Illinois, Kaskaskia, Peoria, Tamaroa, ancestors of tribes later pushed west. To those nations, the mounds aren't mysterious. They're part of a known, if ancient, landscape, sacred places tied to older stories. The gap is not between builders and later Indians. The gap is between a specific political order and the many peoples who inherited and reinterpreted its remains. So how did that continuity get broken in our historical memory? One answer is invisible and microscopic. Long before De Soto's soldiers or Marquette's canoes reached every town and village, European pathogens did. Smallpox, measles, influenza, maybe even pig-borne diseases, radiated outward along the same trade and kinship routes that once carried shell beads and copper and stories. They hit societies whose population density, storage systems, and ritual gatherings were optimized for Mississippian life, and turned those strengths into deadly weaknesses. Many of the chiefdoms De Soto encountered were already in flux, struggling with leadership succession, regional rivalries, and resource pressures. Now add mortality rates that, in some places, may have reached half or more of the population in a generation. Whole lineages of ritual specialists, storytellers, and political leaders could be wiped out before they had a chance to pass on much beyond fragments. By the time more sustained colonial records appear, the Southeast and Mississippi Valley are in the aftermath of this demographic apocalypse. Towns have moved, tribes have fused, split or relocated under pressure from disease, war, slave raids, and land grabs. Oral traditions survive, but they're stitched together from memories of worlds repeatedly destroyed and remade. For Europeans looking at this landscape with no understanding of what had been there 200 years earlier, the ruins, the mounds, start to look like evidence of some ancient race that vanished. The living indigenous nations around them, reeling from disaster, are miscast as unrelated latecomers. That miscasting stuck. It was politically convenient. If the builders were gone, then no one living could claim direct ownership. If the current inhabitants were portrayed as too primitive or nomadic to have made such things, then colonizers could tell themselves they were inheriting a vacant legacy. Yet the connections never entirely disappeared. They survived in language families that point back toward the Mississippi heartland. In origin, stories that speak of great towns and migrations along rivers. In ritual practices and symbols that archaeologists can trace from Cahokia's plazas to later mound centers and into modern ceremonial life. Today, many tribal nations are reclaiming those threads openly. Osage scholars and elders visit Cahokia and recognize elements of their own cosmology in the site's layout and alignments. The Quapaw Nation, removed to Oklahoma in the 19th century, maintains that their ancestors lived in the shadow of these mounds. The Peoria tribe of Indians of Oklahoma, descended from Illinois Valley peoples, has worked to assert their historical connections to the region. Other Siouan-speaking groups, including Omaha and Ponca, see in Cahokia a deep time waypoint in their long migration narratives. Indigenous archaeologists, historians, and community leaders are increasingly at the center of interpreting Cahokia, not as a dead anonymous ruin, but as part of a living story that includes them. They challenge questions like who built Cahokia, with counter-questions. Who says we ever stopped being those people? On the ground, that means tribal consultation in research and site management. It means community-driven exhibits that foreground native voices. It means framing the mounds not just as prehistoric curiosities, but as ancestral architecture with ongoing spiritual significance. When you put all of this together, the linguistic ties, the migration stories, the Mississippian successor states, the accounts of early explorers, the scars left by epidemics, you get a very different answer to where did the Cahokians go. They didn't go somewhere else and vanish. They went everywhere their river networks could carry them. They became Osage and Quapaw and Omaha and Kansas and Illinois and many others. They rebuilt and reimagined their world again and again under shattering pressures. Their city died. Their descendants are still here. What vanished wasn't the people. It was the willingness of a conquering society to see them as the rightful heirs of the greatest city North America had ever known. And that erasure, how a metropolis of mounds turned in the American imagination into a mystery with no makers, is its own story. Erasure didn't happen all at once. It settled in layers. The first layer was simple shock. Early French and Spanish accounts in the Mississippi Valley mention mounds, sometimes in passing, sometimes with awe. Priests speculated that some were ancient, older than any living memory. Explorers asked local nations, who built these? And got complicated answers. Stories of ancestors, of powerful leaders, of beings who lived in an earlier age. But Europeans didn't arrive as neutral listeners. They came with a story already in their heads. The New World as an empty stage, waiting for them. Wilderness. Untamed. Underused. The people already here were cast as temporary occupants, not owners. And right away, that story collided with Cahokia, because if you admit that the land once held dense cities, monumental architecture, astronomical observatories, continent-spanning trade, then you have to admit that indigenous peoples weren't just wandering tribes. They had built states, they had managed landscapes, they had histories measured in centuries. That didn't fit the script of manifest destiny. So a second layer of erasure formed, ideological this time. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as the United States expanded westward, politicians, preachers, and amateur scholars began to lean hard into the myth of the empty continent. They described North America as a place where savagery had left no real mark, where civilization would begin only when Europeans ploughed the soil and laid out their own towns. Mounds were a problem. They were undeniable. You could literally trip over them in fields and forests from the Great Lakes to the Gulf. So instead of changing their world view, many Americans changed the builders. This is where the mound builder myth really takes off. By the early 1800s, a cottage industry of speculation had sprung up around earthworks like Cahokia. Newspapers, pamphlets, and lecture circuits promoted the idea that the mounds were not the work of the native nations then living nearby, but of a lost, superior race that had mysteriously vanished. Candidates were tossed around like fan theories, ancient Israelites fleeing across the sea, a branch of Egyptians, Welsh explorers, Vikings, refugees from Atlantis, even one of Noah's sons striking out for a new world. Anything but the people whose reservations and treaty lines kept shrinking on contemporary maps. These weren't fringe ideas, they were mainstream. You had respected clergymen writing that our Indians were too savage and indolent to have organized the labor to build such works. You had influential writers insisting that the true builders had been wiped out by the ancestors of present-day Native Americans, turning the living nations into usurpers, not heirs. It sounds absurd now. But in the 19th century United States, this was politically useful absurdity. Because if the mounds belonged to a vanished white or semi-biblical race, they could be folded into a European-American heritage narrative. They became evidence that people like the current colonizers had always been the true civilizers of this land. and if the native nations on the ground were just later intruders, squatting among the ruins of somebody else's greatness, then their claims to deep ancestral ownership weakened. If they were, in this story, the destroyers of a more refined people, then pushing them off their lands could even be cast as a kind of historical justice. The mound builder myth wasn't just bad archaeology, it was policy fuel. It lubricated the machinery of removal and genocide. As the Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced nations like the Cherokee, Muskogee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw and Seminole west of the Mississippi, writers and politicians reassured themselves and their voters. The people being marched at gunpoint down the Trail of Tears weren't the original owners anyway. The real ancient civilization was long gone. Meanwhile, the physical record of that civilization was being destroyed in real time. This is another layer of erasure, brutal, literal, and made of shovels and ploughs. In the 19th century, St. Louis sat on a landscape that had once rivaled Cahokia in its density of earthworks. Travellers called it Mound City. Dozens of mounds dotted the area, platform mounds, conical mounds, ridged mounds, forming a mirrored metropolis across the river from Cahokia's core. Almost all of them are gone. As St. Louis grew, mounds were levelled for brick factories, for housing, for rail yards, for streets. Some were mined for their rich, compacted soil. Others were simply flattened because they were in the way of modern progress. Newspaper ads in the late 1800s casually mentioned contracts for removing an Indian mound as if it were a stump. The same story played out all across the Midwest and South. Farmers ploughed into mounds for generations, mixing artifacts and human remains into topsoil. Road crews cut through earthworks to lay new alignments. City planners turned platforms that once hosted council houses and temples into convenient building pads. A city that had already been abandoned politically was stripped of its visible grandeur physically. By the time most Americans were taught about their country's past, the evidence of Cahokia's scale had been shredded, bulldozed, or built over. Yet even as the soil was being scraped away, the intellectual story started to crack. By the late 1800s, the Smithsonian Institution decided to investigate the mound question seriously. They sent Cyrus Thomas, a researcher who initially leaned toward the lost race idea, to lead a massive survey of earthworks across the eastern United States. Thomas and his team did something radical for the time. They collected data systematically. They excavated carefully, compared artifact styles, consulted ethnographic accounts, and looked at where mounds actually sat in relation to known historic native sites. In 1894, Thomas published the conclusion that shattered the mound builder myth from the inside. The mounds were built by the ancestors of the indigenous peoples of North America. Period. No Atlanteans, no Israelites, no ghostly vanished Europeans, just Native Americans in deep time. The reaction wasn't a public scandal. It was quieter than that. The lost race theories didn't vanish overnight. They just slowly lost respectability. Serious archaeologists moved on. Amateur romantics and white supremacist writers kept the myth alive in fringe corners. Then, during the Great Depression, another layer of truth was exposed, literally. New Deal programs like the Works Progress Administration hired thousands of workers to assist archaeologists. They dug at sites across the Mississippi Valley, including Cahokia. What they found was a dense stratified history. House floors stacked on house floors, post molds from massive timber circles, burials with rich and clearly native grave goods. As excavation techniques improved through the 20th century, radiocarbon dating, soil analysis and modern mapping turned Cahokia from a curiosity into a well-documented metropolis. There was no serious academic doubt left. This had been a native city, as complex and planned as many old-world urban centres, and yet somehow That knowledge never quite made it into the story most Americans learn in school. Open a typical US history textbook even today, and the narrative often jumps from Ice Age hunters crossing the Bering Land Bridge to Columbus, then fast forwards to Jamestown and Plymouth. Indigenous North America between 1000 and 1500 CE gets a few vague paragraphs. Tribes, villages, maybe a mention of the Iroquois Confederacy. Cahokia, if it appears at all, is often a sidebar, a fun fact. Why? Part of the answer is inertia. Textbooks recycle frameworks from older editions. Once you've built your story around European arrival as the real beginning, anything that complicates that gets treated as extra, not core. Part of it is discomfort. Acknowledging Cahokia as a city comparable in population to London or Paris in its heyday forces a rethinking of what civilization in North America looked like before colonization. It undercuts the idea that European arrival brought history to an empty stage, and part of it is that the old politics never fully died. Telling the truth about indigenous urbanism, agriculture, astronomy, and statecraft makes it harder to justify, even retrospectively, the dispossession that followed. It invites questions about what exactly was destroyed. But the silence is cracking. Tribal nations long dismissed in the Mound Builder myth are asserting their connections to Cahokia and other sites. Indigenous scholars are publishing work that centers native voices and worldviews. Some states are revising curricula to include Mississippian history as a foundational chapter, not an optional aside. Archaeologists are collaborating with native communities, recognizing that oral tradition and scientific excavation are not enemies, but complementary ways of knowing. Bit by bit, Cahokia is re-entering the story, not as a mystery ripped from fantasy novels, not as evidence of some lost white race, but as what it always was, a native city at the heart of a continent, deliberately forgotten because its existence made too many colonial lies harder to tell. And once you put it back where it belongs, other things start to shift too. Our sense of what America was and what it could still become, when we stop pretending that the greatest city on this land appeared only after Europeans arrived. If you go to Cahokia today, the first thing that hits you is how quiet it is. You stand on a grassy rise in southern Illinois, within sight of the St. Louis skyline, and you're looking at hills, neatly mowed, gently sloping, dotted with informational signs. Cars hum on nearby highways. Subdivisions sit just beyond the tree line. A power line cuts the horizon. It does not look like a city that once rivaled medieval London. And yet this quiet patch of land, Cahokia Mound's State Historic Site, has been recognized by UNESCO since 1982 as a World Heritage Site, in the same category as the pyramids, the Great Wall, Machu Picchu. On paper, it's global treasure. In reality, it's running on state park budgets. There's a small but thoughtful interpretive centre, built in the 1980s, with dioramas and artifacts and a reconstructed chunk of a Cahokian neighbourhood. There are trails winding past Monk's Mound, Woodhenge, and dozens of smaller mounds. There are dedicated staff, volunteers, and tribal partners doing everything they can. But compare the funding, tourist numbers, and national attention that Cahokia gets to, say, Stonehenge or Pompeii, and the gap is staggering. Most people in the United States have never even heard of it. Part of that is visibility. Cahokia is made of earth, not stone. Time is cruel to dirt. Rain rounds edges. Grass hides geometry. You have to know what you're looking at. The other part is political will. For generations, the US has been willing to pour money into preserving certain kinds of pasts. Colonial forts, battlefields, presidential homes, while places like Cahokia sat on the margin. But here's the twist. The less obvious Cahokia is on the surface, the more it's blazing into view underground. Because in the last few decades, archaeologists have started hitting the site with technologies that would have seemed like sorcery to those first WPA crews in the 1930s. LIDAR, airborne laser scanning, can peel away the forest canopy and modern buildings digitally, revealing subtle rises and depressions in the earth. When researchers flew LIDAR over the American bottom, they didn't just see Monk's Mound. They saw neighbourhoods, causeways, borrow pits, mound clusters that had been ploughed flat but still left a ghostly imprint. The map of Greater Cahokia exploded. What we used to think of as a single, compact city turned out to be the dense core of a sprawling urban complex. Suburbs, satellite towns, farmsteads, spreading over tens of square miles along the Mississippi floodplain and bluffs. Estimates of population and complexity keep going up, not down. Then there's soil chemistry. By taking tiny samples across the site and analysing elements like phosphorus and heavy metals, researchers can reconstruct where people lived, where they butchered animals, where they dumped trash, where fires burned hot. You can see invisible neighbourhoods, rich, nutrient-heavy patches where houses once stood, clean, swept surfaces where rituals happened, dark, disturbed soil marking graves and post holes. This kind of analysis has shown that Cahokia wasn't just a random sprawl. Activity was zoned. There were distinct districts, craft areas, elite compounds, commoner neighbourhoods, organised around plazas and mound complexes, all plugged into that massive Grand Plaza and its cardinal alignments. Even human remains are starting to talk in new ways. Ancient DNA, where it can be ethically and successfully extracted, is allowing researchers to ask questions that were once unthinkable. How were people related within burial mounds? Were elites from local lineages or immigrants from distant regions? How much genetic diversity existed inside the city? Isotope analysis, looking at the chemical signature in bones and teeth, reveals where individuals grew up based on the water and food they consumed as children. Studies suggest that Cahokia attracted people from far beyond the immediate region. Some individuals buried there were born hundreds of miles away. This wasn't an isolated town. It was drawing migrants like any major metropolis. All of this is being done under increasing scrutiny and collaboration with indigenous nations, who rightly insist that research on ancestors be guided by respect, consent, and cultural protocols. Science is finally being forced to grow up, not just in methods, but in relationships. But for every new insight we gain, there's a clock ticking in the background, because only a fraction of ancient Cahokia is actually protected. The State Historic Site covers the core area, Monk's Mound, the Grand Plaza, Woodhenge, a cluster of surrounding mounds. Beyond that boundary, you hit private property fast, subdivisions, warehouses, cornfields, parking lots. Some of those places sit on top of unexcavated mounds, or the ghost outlines of neighbourhoods detected by LIDAR. Others contain intact deposits we don't even know about yet. Development pressure in the region is constant. Every time a new road is widened, a new warehouse complex planned, a new subdivision proposed, there's a tension, progress, jobs, tax revenue, versus 1,000-year-old history buried a metre below the surface. Sometimes laws and surveys catch important remains in time, sometimes they don't. In many cases, what survives is whatever early 20th century developers happen to leave alone. This is the brutal irony. A city erased once by abandonment and ploughs is still being nibbled away by asphalt and concrete, even as we're finally beginning to understand what it was. That's why there's a growing push to change Cahokia's status. Scholars, tribal nations, local advocates and preservationists have been arguing that a site of this magnitude shouldn't have to scrape by on state funding cycles and grant applications. They've been pushing for Cahokia Mounds to become a unit of the National Park Service, or at least a more robust, federally supported national monument with wider protective buffers. That conversation has inched forward. Resolutions, feasibility studies, periodic bursts of political attention, but it hasn't fully crossed the finish line yet. The gap between what Cahokia is, historically, and what it is in law and budget terms is still wide. Meanwhile, public interest is starting to catch up from the ground up. School groups are coming through in larger numbers. Teachers are sneaking Cahokia into curriculums that barely mention it. Documentaries, podcasts and books are finally telling the story in ways that reach beyond academic journals. Indigenous scholars and artists are recentering Mississippian history in their own narratives. Visitors climb Monk's Mound and read interpretive signs about a city that existed 1,000 years before the United States was even an idea, and something clicks. This continent was not waiting to be discovered. It was already busy, and that realization is the real threat and promise of Cahokia. Because once you accept that a city of perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 people, embedded in a metro region of maybe 30,000 to 40,000 more, rose and fell here before Columbus ever got lost in the Caribbean, a lot of comfortable stories start to wobble. You can't say, with a straight face, that indigenous North America was just scattered bands of nomads. You can't easily maintain the fiction that urban density, monumental architecture, or complex governance were European imports. You have to reckon with a different timeline of civilization on this land, one where agriculture, astronomy, large-scale labour organisation, and long-distance trade were being worked out in parallel with, not in the shadow of, the old world. Cahokia forces a shift from nothing was here to something was here, and we destroyed or ignored most of it. It also raises uncomfortable questions. How many other Cahokias, smaller, less visible, built in wood and earth, have we already bulldozed without realizing it? How much of indigenous scientific knowledge and political innovation has been erased because it didn't come with stone temples or written chronicles in European languages? And, maybe most importantly, whose past gets the scaffolding and security fences and restoration crews, and whose past is left to quietly sink back into the soil? Standing on Monk's Mound, you can look one way and see the glass towers of St. Louis. Look the other way and see the faint outlines of ancient earthworks under the grass. One city declared itself the start of history in this region. The other is only now being allowed to re-enter the story. Cahokia today is a paradox, a world-class archaeological treasure that most of the world has never heard of, a place half protected and half suburban, a site where cutting-edge science and ancient oral traditions are finally being listened to together. It is still giving up secrets about astronomy, migration, politics, climate adaptation every year. But its most disruptive revelation is simple. The Americas were full of cities, states, and stories long before Europe ever arrived. Those stories were deliberately buried, sometimes under myth, sometimes under concrete. Cahokia is what happens when one of them refuses to stay buried. For most of American history, Cahokia was treated like a glitch, an anomaly, a rumour, an inconvenience quietly buried under cornfields, subdivisions, and a story about this continent that needed indigenous people to be background characters, not city builders. We started this journey with a few overgrown hills next to a highway, mounds that most drivers never notice, a name, Cahokia, that doesn't belong to the people who actually lived there, a place that, on first glance, looks like nothing much at all. Then we peeled it back. We saw a city explode out of the Mississippi bottomlands in a single human lifetime. Grand plazas carved and levelled by hand, a 4-terrace pyramid higher than almost anything else on the continent, a solar calendar in circles of red cedar, neighbourhoods laid out on a cosmic grid. We watched farmers turn into engineers, priests into astronomers, organisers into something uncomfortably close to politicians. We saw feasts and festivals and trade canoes sliding down rivers loaded with obsidian, copper, shells and stories. We also walked into the shadows. Mound 72, human sacrifice. Young women arranged like offerings, power that demanded bodies. A city that, like every complex society, carried beauty and brutality in the same hands. Then came decline. Floods, droughts, political fracture, exhausted soils, or some combination we still don't fully understand. The lights went out, the mounds softened, the people didn't vanish. They became somebody else's ancestors. But the memory of the city itself was allowed and then encouraged to fade. Cahokia went from metropolis to empty land in the American imagination. That erasure wasn't an accident. It made conquest easier. It allowed a story where civilization arrived here on wooden ships instead of already standing on earthen platforms watching the solstice sunrise. And that's why Cahokia matters now. Because once you know this was here, this scale, this intelligence, this experimentation, you can't unknow it. You have to rewrite the mental map of American history. You have to admit that the foundations of this place are older and more complicated than the textbooks usually admit. Cahokia reminds us that indigenous North America was not a blank canvas. It was a mosaic of nations, cities, fields, shrines, and trade routes. It still is. It also asks something of us. Respect, first of all. Respect for the descendants of the people who built this city, whose oral traditions carry memories that archaeology is only starting to catch up to. Respect in how we dig, how we display, how we tell the story, and when we choose not to excavate at all. Attention, second. These mounds won't shout for themselves. If Cahokia is going to survive another 1,000 years, it needs people who know it exists and care that it does. If you ever get the chance, go. Climb Monk's Mound and feel how your lungs burn on the same slope thousands of feet once climbed, carrying baskets of earth. Stand at Woodhenge at sunrise and imagine drums, voices, breath steaming in the cold. Walk the Grand Plaza and picture it crowded, noisy, alive. Then tell someone. Tell your kids, your students, your friends who think nothing was here before 1492. Share articles, share this video. Put Cahokia back in the story every time you can. And if you want to keep going down this rabbit hole of hidden worlds and almost forgotten cities, there's more waiting. Over at sleepytimehistory.com, there's a book that dives into prehistoric secrets, lost bottlenecks, vanished species, ancient experiments in being human. If this kind of deep, quiet history helped you see Cahokia differently, you'll probably love that too. For now, if this journey meant something to you, help it reach the people who've never even heard the word Cahokia. Hit like so the algorithm knows this story is worth hearing. Subscribe if you want more long, strange walks through the parts of history that got edited out. Share this with someone who still thinks American history starts with Columbus. And in the comments, let me know where you're listening from. 1,000 years ago, people from all over this continent came to Cahokia to trade, to worship, to argue, to dream. Tonight, we get to gather again in a different kind of plaza, scattered across the world, connected by a thread of curiosity, remembering a city that was never meant to be remembered. Cahokia refused to stay buried. Now it's our job to make sure it's never forgotten again.